It is rare, genuinely rare, for the leader of a nation at war to simultaneously write a personal letter to a foreign president and to that country's legislature at the same time. It almost never happens in modern diplomacy. But that is exactly what Volodymyr Zelensky did this week. With Russia launching what he described as a massive attack on Ukraine, Zelensky wrote to both President Trump and the United States Congress, personally handing the letter to visiting American lawmakers in Kyiv, pleading for one thing above all else: anti-ballistic missiles. Because, as Zelensky put it himself, as long as Russia can rely on missiles, its interest in diplomacy is not real. While the world's cameras are pointed at the Strait of Hormuz and the skies above Iran, the war in Europe, now in its fifth year at full scale, is still grinding on. Today, we break down why Ukraine's missile crisis may be the most consequential story that most people are not watching. Here is what we are covering. First, why Zelensky made the unprecedented move of writing simultaneously to Trump and Congress, and what he is actually asking for. Second, the EU's €28.3 billion Ukraine support loan, and what von der Leyen pledged about integrating Ukraine into European air defense. Third, Russia's psychological warfare strategy, and why one of the world's leading historians says the softest target is the White House. Fourth, what Russia bombing evangelical churches in Ukraine tells us about the ideological dimension of this war. And fifth, the international diplomatic picture: India at the Gymnich Forum, the UN Secretary-General's warning about a divided Security Council, and why Ukraine's path to EU membership may be moving faster than expected. Let's get into it. Let's build the story from the ground up. On May 26, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen traveled to Vilnius, Lithuania, and her message was stark. Speaking from the Baltic states, she declared that Europe stands in full solidarity with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and issued a direct message to Russia: you will fail. She announced billions in support through the SAFE program, cohesion policy funds, and the €28 billion East Invest facility, while also proposing a new protocol for hybrid threats to enable rapid mobilization of all EU instruments. Also on May 26, historian Anne Applebaum documented a chilling dimension of Russia's war. According to posts from Anne Applebaum, Russian propagandists were justifying the bombing of evangelical churches in Ukraine by calling evangelicalism a, quote, satanic sect and a shitty religion from the USA, and calling for them to burn them all. This is not just a military campaign. It is an ideological one. Moving into May 27, Zelensky published what may be his most urgent public communication yet. According to posts from @Zelensky UA, he sent a special letter described as quite rare simultaneously to the US President and to Congress. The letter was officially delivered to Washington on May 26, and Zelensky personally handed it to visiting US Congressmen Richard Blumenthal and Jim Himes in Kyiv on May 27. The core demand: anti-ballistic missiles. Zelensky's argument is direct: Russia's interest in diplomacy is not real as long as it can continue launching missiles. His exact framing, as posted by @Zelensky UA, the sooner we are able to provide greater protection against ballistic threats, the sooner we will be able to make diplomacy work. That same day, EU Commission President von der Leyen confirmed on a call with Zelensky that Europe is fully behind Ukraine's air defense needs, pledging that air defense and drone and counter-drone capabilities are among Europe's most urgent defense priorities, and that Ukraine will be fully integrated into these efforts. The Ukraine support loan at €28.3 billion for this year alone would help cover military needs. The Hill reported that Zelensky is specifically pleading for Patriot missile interceptors, the advanced system designed to defeat ballistic missiles. And the diplomatic activity is not limited to the US and EU. India's Foreign Minister Jaishankar, at the EU Gymnich Forum in Cyprus, met with Ukraine's Foreign Minister Sybiha to exchange views on the conflict, a notable signal that India, which has historically maintained neutrality, is continuing to engage at the highest levels. The first question many viewers are asking is, why does Ukraine need anti-ballistic missiles so urgently, and why is this the specific weapon Zelensky is prioritizing above everything else? The short answer is that Russia's shift to ballistic missile strikes, weapons that travel at hypersonic speeds and are far harder to intercept than cruise missiles, has rendered much of Ukraine's existing air defense obsolete. Patriot systems are among the few platforms capable of defeating ballistic threats, but each interceptor costs millions of dollars and stocks are finite. As Zelensky has argued repeatedly, the diplomatic leverage shifts fundamentally the moment Ukraine can reliably deny Russia its missile option, because at that point, Russia's only tool for coercing Ukraine from the air is neutralized. A second pressing question is, what is Russia's strategy right now, and is it working? On that front, historian Timothy Snyder provided one of the sharpest assessments in the dataset. According to posts from Timothy Snyder, the psychological war is the only one Russia can win, and the softest target, as ever, is the White House. This may suggest that Moscow is less focused on battlefield gains and more focused on fracturing Western political will. Evidence for that theory: Russia continues to bomb civilian targets including churches while simultaneously pushing peace-sounding messaging designed to make Western leaders feel that concessions from Ukraine, not Russia, are the path to peace. This is a well-documented Russian information warfare pattern. The EU's response has been notably resolute. Von der Leyen's Baltic trip and the Eastern Flank Watch initiative signal that Europe is institutionalizing its commitment to deterrence rather than leaving it to member state discretion. The €28 billion East Invest facility and the SAFE program represent a structural shift in European defense posture, one that did not exist before February 2022. But there is a critical gap. Europe has capabilities, but Ukraine needs the political authorization and the physical weapons now, not in 12 months. The EU accession path is also accelerating, with Zelensky indicating that all 6 negotiation clusters could open, with the fundamentals cluster opening in June. Some analysts believe this rapid accession push is itself a security measure. EU membership, even in process, complicates any future attempt by Russia to argue that Ukraine is not firmly within the Western orbit. Why does Ukraine need anti-ballistic missiles specifically, and why is this Zelensky's top priority right now? Ballistic missiles travel at hypersonic speeds and are far harder to intercept than cruise missiles, making existing Ukrainian air defense largely ineffective against them. Patriot systems are among the few platforms that can engage ballistic threats. Zelensky's argument is that once Russia loses the missile coercion option, its leverage over diplomacy collapses, making missile defense the key to forcing a real negotiation. What is Russia's current strategy, and is the psychological war it is waging actually working? According to Timothy Snyder, Russia may be winning the psychological war even as it struggles on the battlefield, with the White House identified as the softest target. The pattern of bombing civilian sites, including churches, while pushing peace-sounding narratives may be designed to fracture Western political consensus rather than achieve military objectives directly. In Ukraine itself, the stakes of this missile diplomacy could not be more visceral. Zelensky is conducting high-level diplomatic meetings with von der Leyen, with visiting U.S. congressmen, with EU officials, while simultaneously briefing his military commanders on frontline defensive operations. According to Zelensky UA, he held a detailed meeting on Ukraine's defense, with Commander-in-Chief Syrsky and Chief of the General Staff Nadov briefing on the situation. This is a wartime president managing simultaneous military, diplomatic, and informational fronts with no margin for error. Across the European Union, the policy response is taking shape at remarkable speed. Von der Leyen is in Vilnius declaring Baltic solidarity, announcing the Eastern Flank Watch, and pledging billions in new facilities all in a single trip. The EU's posture has moved decisively from reactive aid to structural defense integration. The opening of Ukraine's EU accession fundamentals cluster in June, if it happens, would be historically significant, a formal institutional pathway that, once begun, is extremely difficult to reverse regardless of future political changes in any individual member state. In the United States, the political dynamics are genuinely complex. Congress has provided strong bipartisan support, as acknowledged by Zelensky, but the White House is simultaneously managing the Iran war, the China-Taiwan-South China Sea pressure, and domestic political pressures. According to The Hill, Zelensky is specifically pleading for Patriot interceptors, a politically loaded request, because the U.S. has finite stocks and is itself consuming them in the Middle East theater. Historian Snyder's observation that the White House is Russia's softest psychological target becomes more pointed in this context. The administration is managing too many crises simultaneously, and that cognitive overload may be exactly what Moscow is exploiting. In Russia and the surrounding region, the ideological dimension is hardening. And Applebaum's documentation of pro-Russian rhetoric justifying church bombings as protection of Christianity reflects a deeper radicalization of the information space that makes any negotiated settlement harder to sell domestically inside Russia, and therefore harder for Putin to accept without appearing weak. In the interest of fairness, let's consider the counterarguments to accelerating weapons deliveries to Ukraine. The strongest version of the skeptical case goes something like this: every new weapons system delivered to Ukraine extends the war rather than ending it. The more capable Ukraine's defenses become, the less incentive it has to negotiate, and the longer ordinary Ukrainians suffer on the front lines. There is also a resource scarcity argument. Patriot interceptors are genuinely finite, and the United States is already consuming them in the Middle East theater. Providing them to Ukraine may leave gaps in other theaters. And there is the escalation risk. Some analysts argue that continued Western military support increases the probability that Russia, feeling cornered, reaches for more extreme options, including non-conventional deterrence measures. These are serious arguments made in good faith by thoughtful people. However, the counterpoint articulated most directly in Zelensky's own communications is that Russia's ballistic missile campaign has made diplomatic resolution structurally impossible. According to Zelensky UA, as long as Russia can rely on missiles, its interest in diplomacy is not real. The United Nations Secretary General has warned, according to Antonio Guterres, that when the Security Council is divided, the consequences are felt across the world, and that amid intensifying conflicts and geopolitical divisions, the Council must act in the interest of peace. The UN is calling for the Charter to be honored. But honoring it requires political will, and that will is being eroded, as Snyder warns, by a deliberate Russian psychological operation targeting Western leaders directly. Here is the darkest irony: the one thing that could most quickly end Russia's interest in continuing the missile war, a credible anti-ballistic defense, is also the one thing most constrained by the very other wars that are consuming Western attention and resources. Russia may not need to win on the battlefield. It may just need to wait. If this breakdown helped you understand what is really at stake in Ukraine right now, subscribe and hit the bell. We cover every development as it happens. And drop your answer to today's question in the comments.